A baby is born. The doctor looks at the infant's genitalia and declares it a boy. Though unseen by the naked eye, this particular baby has biology not like other boys. This is the origin story of most trans girls, trans women, as well as intersex people. You might be wondering, how are trans people biologically different? After all, most talking points about us solely focus on us having a gender identity that is different than our biological sex. Behind the scenes, however, scientific studies have been uncovering a more complete story, that not even our biology is as straightforward as many like to think. It is rather as multifaceted as being intersex. A newborn's genitalia is the one sex trait out of a handful of biological sex traits that is immediately visible to the naked eye. Thus, a newborn's assigned sex is typically based on it, and for about 97.5% of births, it's a safe assumption to go with, as most genitals are indeed congruent with or match up with the rest of one's biological sex traits, such as having testes or ovaries, having male or female sex chromosomes, having male or female hormonal systems or sensitivity to certain hormones, and possessing other sexually dimorphic organs. For 2.5% of births, however, not all these biological sex traits line up with each other. To give a few examples, a small percentage of babies can be and are born with vaginas and testes instead of ovaries. A small percentage of babies can be and are born with a variation of sex chromosomes other than the XX for female and XY for male. A small percentage of babies can be and are born with ambiguous genitalia, or even a smaller percentage can be born with one specific genitalia that later morphs into another at puberty. The list goes on. For majority of these cases, the term intersex is used, often citing androgen sensitivity or insensitivity as the key factor in the condition, which develops sexually dimorphic organs atypical from male or female patterns, often at birth, be it sometimes manifest at puberty. Likewise, with trans people, we too are often born with a similar prenatal hormonal disposition that develops one of our sexually dimorphic vital organs to not be congruent with our genitalia in the conventional sense. That organ in question is the brain. To be clear, I'm not referring to gender identity here, but rather the mushy, squishy, spongy organ housed inside the skull, the physical brain. Much like genitals, gonads, and sex chromosomes, brains also come in male-typical and female-typical shapes, forms, traits, patterns, and regions, sexually differing between cis men and cis women in both anatomy and activation patterns. In other words, put a human brain on a table and a trained eye would be able to differentiate whether it's a male brain or a female brain. So, what about trans people? How do ours look like? In 1995, a group of neuroscientists set out to explore this very question, the biological anatomy of trans women's brains, the findings of which were published under this research paper. This was the first of many scientific research studies examining the neuroscience of trans girls and trans women. In the original study, researchers dissected the brains of trans women post-mortem, that is, after death, and compared our brain to the brains of cis women and cis men. It was found that the region in the brain responsible for sex and anxiety responses, known as beta nucleus of the stria terminalis, is similar between cis women and trans women, and significantly different between trans women and cis men. After the publication of this study, other neuroscientists conducted similar independent studies, reliably finding the same results with larger sample groups. What's even more interesting is that researchers continued to find more regions and aspects of trans women brains to also correspond with female typical brains, such as with the insula pars triangularis, eukinate nucleus, cortex thickness, subcortical brain volume, as well as similarities in cerebellum and hypothalamus. It should be noted that some of these studies also controlled for the effects of HRT by including trans women subjects who had not yet undergone hormone replacement therapy, concluding that these findings were indeed pre-existent and not caused by the effects of taking HRT. With newer technology, newer research methods have risen, making use of MRI imaging and CT scans to examine our brains in action, and more revealing discoveries have been and are being made, mainly that trans women's brains also have female typical activation patterns. In other words, from a biological stance view, both in anatomy, form, and activation, function, the sex of our brains shifts towards our gender identity, female. Interestingly, some properties of trans brains have also been discovered to be unique only to us and not commonly found in cis people altogether. Things such as the localization of gray and white matter. On top of that, different types of trans feminine brains are hypothesized to exist, all being female typical but showing discrepancies between each other in other areas. Sexual differentiation of the brain into male or female occurs during the fetal stages of development, during the second half of pregnancy to be exact, while the physical development of the genitalia occurs much sooner, within the first trimester. Since brain and genital sexual differentiation occurs at different stages, it is technically possible for them to diverge, as is the case with trans people, leading to a mismatch between the sex of our brain and our assigned sex at birth, which later on manifests for us in form of gender dysphoria. Fetal brain development is typically influenced by the prenatal environment, or the womb. One leading theory suggests that trans girls have a form of partial androgen insensitivity, which leads to the formation of female typical brains with male typical genitalia. This in effect is a continuum of an intersex condition by the same name. Furthermore, androgen insensitivity to prenatal hormones is believed to be genetic based, as research studies on identical trans twins seem to indicate. The chances of identical twins who share the exact same genetic makeup and womb both being trans has been observed to be 33%. That is 1 out of 3 cases. Whereas with pairs of non-identical twins who do not share the exact same genetic makeup but do share the same womb, chances of both being transgender was significantly lower at only 2.6%, or 1 in 39, meaning having a trans brain is likely genetically determined, or in the very least, developing a trans identity has a deeply rooted biological component to it. Despite current culture world's obsession with the biological sex of trans people, science has been finding that even from a biological perspective, we are different. That trans girls and trans women do indeed have biologically female typical brains, something that even a well-known right-wing television psychologist has given due acknowledgement to.
Interestingly, there's a very serious study by the Cleveland Clinic that has done MRI scans on transgender persons that has determined that the brain of a transgender person is much more similar in function and profile. If you are a transgender woman, that your brain is much more aligned functionally with a straight female than it is with a male.
Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more, like and subscribe. I am Lilith Lakhmir, and these have been some of my musings.